Aisha Grant stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 412 with the calm confidence of someone who'd paid handsomely for every inch of that luxurious space. The soft glow of recessed LED lighting traced the curves of polished walnut accents and cream leather seats, each one perfectly angled for both conversation and solitude. A hush fell over the cabin as other passengers glanced up. Many recognized her Aerostar Global badge, and then quickly averted their eyes, uncertain how to behave around a woman in her position. She slid into her assigned seat, 1A, at the window, and closed her eyes for a moment. The drone of the engines, the gentle hum of pre-flight announcements, even the muted clink of a flight attendant's cart, all of it felt familiar, comforting. It was exactly the routine she needed before landing in Miami for the final board meeting to seal a $3,900,000,000 0 cents acquisition. She inhaled, basking in a rare moment of peace before the high-stakes day ahead. Then Sarah Monroe appeared at her side, clipboard in hand, scanner dangling from her wrist. Aisha blinked, expecting the usual cordial greeting. Instead, Sarah's face was tight, her lips pressed into a neutral line that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry, Ms. Grant," Sarah said, voice pitched just above polite. "There's been an equipment change. We need to reassign your seat." Aisha's chest tightened. "Equipment change?" she echoed, undoing her seat belt with a controlled exhale. "My reservation was confirmed yesterday. I'm in 1A. Sarah's gaze flicked to her tablet screen, then back up. "I understand your frustration, but first class is fully booked. You've been assigned Economy Plus." A heartbeat stretched. Aisha felt the air in the cabin crystallize around her. The passengers seated across the aisle felt it too, an electric tension that pulsed in the quiet. The man in 1B swallowed his coffee nervously. A young couple 2 rows back exchanged glances. Even the flight attendant who'd just stowed the beverage cart paused mid-tack. Aisha let her gaze slide over her own charcoal gray suit. Tailored, expensive, the armor she'd worn through boardrooms and courtrooms. She smoothed an invisible crease on her sleeve. "Excuse me," she said, voice soft but unwavering. "I paid for first class." Sarah's grip on the tablet tightened. Her knuckles whitened around the scanner. She took a step back, scanning the screen again as though willing the words to change. "Ma'am, I'm only following protocol," she said, her tone flat. Aisha rose from her seat, heart pounding. The cabin felt suddenly too small, too narrow for everything she had to say. "Protocol?" she asked, her voice carrying like a stone tossed into still water. "Protocol says you confirm the passenger's reservation before you force her to swallow the economy line." Heads turned. A murmur rose like a wave ready to crash. Sarah's jaw clenched. She swallowed. "I'm going to need you to take your seat in Economy Plus," she said, scanning Aisha's boarding pass as though it were a mistake in her hands. The scanner beeped once, unmoved by the gravity of the moment. Then it registered the tag, or rather, failed to. The screen flashed. Seat changed. 14C, Economy Plus. Aisha stood perfectly still, the only movement her steady exhale. She met Sarah's eyes with a gaze honed by decades of battling condescension. "Do you know who I am?" The words were quiet, but every soul in that cabin heard them. Sarah's cheeks drained of color. For a fraction of a second, the scanner lowered. The cold veneer cracked. Aisha felt the power shift, subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't about entitlement. It was about respect. It was about her hard-won place in a world that so often told her she didn't belong. The cabin fell silent. The gentle hum of the engines, the recorded announcements, even the padded footsteps of flight attendants, all of it receded, all eyes on Sarah Monroe. who swallowed again, awareness flooding her features that she'd just tried to pull rank against the incoming CEO of Coastal Air's suitor. Aisha inhaled once more, her pulse steadying. She relaxed her shoulders, a small concession to the moment's intensity. "I'll wait at the gate," she said, voice crisp. She turned and slipped past the cluster of shocked passengers, each offering her just the faintest nod of solidarity. As she passed into the aisle, she let her mind click into forward gear. No theatrics, no raised voice, just a calm calculation. She might have been bumped today, but this was far from over, and as the cabin door slid shut behind her, muffling the muted protests of the remaining first-class passengers, Ashi Grant knew one thing for certain. No matter how many seats they reassigned, her resolve would never find a downgrade. At 5:00 AM, Manhattan was still draped in darkness, the city's skyscrapers glittering like distant constellations against a velvet sky. In her penthouse on the 52nd floor, Aisha Grant stirred awake to the gentle chime of her alarm. It was the same melody it had been for 20 years. Her tether to the relentless drive that had carried her from junior analyst to one of the most powerful CEOs in global. She paused at the edge of her king-size bed, sliding her feet into soft slippers. For a moment, she allowed herself to savor the quiet air, heavy with the faint scent of ylang-ylang from her diffuser. The world beyond her floor-to-ceiling windows felt miles away and mercifully silent. But she knew better than to indulge in stillness for long. In her line of work, every second counted. 20 years earlier, she might have lingered. She would have lingered before boarding a flight, before walking into a conference room full of men who dismissed her at first glance, before wiping away an invisible tear when yet another promotion slipped through her fingers. But that was then. Now, as the CEO of Aerostar Global, she honored the memory of those setbacks by obliterating any doubt of her competence and her right to claim every inch of success she'd earned. She dressed with deliberate precision, a bespoke charcoal gray pantsuit that hugged her silhouette, a crisp white blouse and a strand of simple pearls, her mother's legacy of poise. She clipped her hair back into a low chignon, the faint silver threads at her temples catching the light. As she fastened her pearl earrings, she caught a glimpse of herself in the vanity mirror. The woman who stared back was unrecognizable from the one who'd first walked these halls as a terrified intern. Her posture was regal, her gaze unflinching. Down the hall, her housekeeper Gloria knocked softly and entered with a tray. "Good morning, Ms. Grant," she said, placing a small porcelain cup of rich espresso beside a plate of avocado toast. Gloria had been with her for 15 years. Through late nights of pitch decks, early mornings of jet-lagged red eyes, and every triumph and stumble in between. She was one of the few people who knew both sides of Aisha, the public figure and the private woman striving to keep her promise to herself. "Thank you, Gloria," Aisha replied, lifting the cup to her lips. The bitterness of the espresso was a welcome jolt, a reminder that comfort without challenge felt hollow. "Big day ahead." Her voice was warm, but her eyes were already calculating, scanning the digital summary on her tablet. Coastal Air acquisition vote, final board meeting, $3,900,000,000, 0 cents valuation, equity dilution percentages, risk assessments. The numbers danced across the screen like partners in a complex choreography. Gloria nodded knowingly. "You show them who's boss," she said gently, brushing a stray curl from her face. Aisha offered a small, genuine smile. "Always," she said, though the words carried more weight than casual bravado suggested. 20 minutes later, she was on her Peloton bike, legs pumping to the steady beat of a curated playlist. The early morning ride wasn't about calories burned or leaderboard standings. It was meditation in motion, a way to steel her mind for the barrage of objections she'd face later. She pictured the conferring board members, the skeptical glances, the antiquated attitudes that still lingered in corporate America. She pedaled faster, After her workout, she retreated to her marble bathroom. Steam rose from the floor-to-ceiling shower as she lathered an invigorating salt scrub into her skin. In those minutes, she visualized the meeting room at Coastal Air's headquarters. Dark wood paneling, the air thick with expectation. She imagined the moment she'd present her revised integration plan, her vision of cultural transformation as vital as the financial merger itself. She let the water erase any last trace of doubt. Dressed now in a tailored wool coat and carrying her Mont Blanc pen, "The one your father gave you?" she'd whispered to herself. Aisha stood by the living room windows, looking out at the awakening city. The grid of avenues and side streets gleamed with headlights and taillights, moving rivers of gold and white. She thought of the journey here, the late nights at her first firm, where she'd been one of only 3 black women in a sea of colleagues. The whispered comments when she challenged a male senior partner. The sting of being told, "These things happen," when she'd complained about unequal treatment. That pain had a purpose now. It fueled every decision she made, every strategy she crafted. It reminded her that comfort, for her, was always earned. It reminded her that the board meeting in Miami was about more than a $3,900,000,000 acquisition. It was about setting a new standard of respect, accountability, and equity. At 6:30 a.m., her driver, Marcus, arrived. A former Navy officer with a quiet gravity, he pulled the sedan up to the entrance. Aisha tucked her pen into her leather portfolio alongside printed copies of her final presentation. She stepped into the elevator, pausing briefly as the doors closed to center herself. The ride down felt like a countdown to destiny. "Have a good meeting," Marcus said once she was seated. His tone was respectful, unassuming, but she sensed the pride he carried in her accomplishments. That pride was a mirror of her own. "Thank you," she replied, fastening her seatbelt. "Because I will." As the car slipped onto the expressway toward O'Hare International, Aisha took one last sip of her now slightly cooled espresso. The city skyline receded behind her, but the image of Manhattan's towers remained etched in her mind. No matter where she went, no matter how often she was knocked down or shuffled aside, she would always rise. Because she had to. Not just for herself, but for every woman who'd ever been told and today she planned to prove that belonging wasn't granted. It was claimed. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the floor-to-ceiling windows of O'Hare International's Terminal 3 as Aisha Grant exited the car. She took a deep breath of crisp Chicago air, centering herself. The long drive from Manhattan had been quiet, too quiet. Her mind racing through board presentations and possible objections. Today wasn't just another meeting, it was the culmination of 18 months of grueling negotiations to acquire Coastal Air for $3,900,000,000, 0 cents. Every detail had to be flawless. Inside the terminal, the priority check-in line was mercifully short. A handful of early bird travelers, frequent flyers in crisp suits, nodded in her direction, some smiling politely, others feigning indifference. Aisha offered a curt nod in return, her attention already on the sleek kiosk that bore the Aerostar global emblem. She tapped her finger on her phone's mobile check-in app and watched the confirmation screen. Seat 1A, first class, confirmed. Good. One less thing to worry about. "Ms. Grant?" The gate agent's voice cut through her focus. She looked up to see James O'Leary, his name tag glittering under fluorescent lights. James, a young man with earnest eyes and a well-pressed uniform, had checked her in before on Jubilee flights. He knew her name. She knew his friendliness. "Good morning, James," she said, extending her phone. He scanned the mobile boarding pass, brows furrowed as his scanner beeped. He leaned closer to the screen. Aisha caught a flicker of something, confusion, maybe even apprehension, in his eyes. "I'm showing you're in seat 14C, he said, voice low. Economy plus. Time seemed to slow. Aisha's chest tightened. "Excuse me?" she repeated evenly, though her heart kicked against her ribs. "I booked first class as usual." She tapped the confirmation screen on her phone. "It's right here." James scrolled through his system. "I see that. There was an equipment change overnight. The Boeing 787 we planned for this flight is sidelined for maintenance, so they swapped in an Airbus A320. First class capacity dropped from 8 seats to 4. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The system auto-reassigned some passengers. You were one of them." A cold knot formed in Aisha's stomach. Auto-reassigned? Her voice was measured, but her pulse spiked. The gentle rush of the terminal, luggage wheels gliding, distant announcements, faded into a background hum. She felt suddenly dislocated, as though the ground had shifted beneath her. James's lips curved in an apologetic half-smile. "I'm very sorry. We've noted your platinum status in the system, and you'll get priority at the gate if anything opens up. We'll also issue you a mile credit. But right now, first class is full." She forced herself to inhale slowly, keeping her expression calm. Inside, a familiar sting of indignity burned. This wasn't the first time she'd been shuffled aside by some impersonal algorithm or dismissive policy. But today, of all days, she couldn't afford to let it slide. "I appreciate the offer," she said quietly, "but I need to be in first class." She spoke the words not as a demand born of entitlement, but as an assertion of respect. "Do you have a supervisor you can check with?" James shifted uncomfortably. "I can call my lead, but odds are the same. I'm really sorry, Miss Grant." She resisted the urge to straighten her shoulders, to remind him how far she'd come as a black woman in a field that had been unwelcoming from day one. Instead, she swallowed, maintaining a veneer of polite poise. "Yes, please do." He stepped aside to make the call. Aisha watched him through the crowd, his foot tapping against the floor. In that motion, she recognized the same tension she saw whenever men in boardrooms hesitated before correcting a mistake they'd made at her expense. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, letting herself recall a younger version of herself. An analyst at a boutique firm, the only woman in a strategy session, being told she had spoken out of turn. And then she opened her eyes, resolved. Moments later, James returned. His cheeks were flushed. "I'm really sorry," he began again. "I spoke to my supervisor, no change. You'd have to wait until the gate for any seat reversal." A hush settled around their little corner of the terminal. A few travelers peeked over their shoulders, curious. A father shushed his child. A businessman in chinos scrolled through his phone, oblivious to the charged moment unfolding. Aisha folded her arms, letting the weight of her disappointment settle into quiet determination. "Understood," she said, voice steady. "Thank you for trying." She tucked her phone away, turned, and slipped into the priority lane for Economy Plus. As she walked away, the sting of demotion lingered like a bruise. Every step felt heavier, the airport carpet moving beneath her in slow motion. Yet beneath that bruise was a spark, a flash of clarity. No algorithm, no maintenance check, no mundane policy would define her worth or diminish her authority. If the system thought it could sideline her with a single line of code, it had underestimated her resolve. She reached her new seat, 14th seat in an exit row, and settled in. The bulkhead afforded extra legroom, but she ignored the nicety. Instead, she pulled out her tablet and began drafting an email to Thomas Harrington, her chief legal officer. "We need to trace every change made to my reservation overnight. I want logs, timestamps, operator IDs, everything." As her fingers flew across the screen, the urgency in her chest shifted from raw frustration into focused strategy. Above the quiet chatter of her fellow economy passengers, Aisha's mind aligned with purpose. The board meeting still awaited $3,900,000,000, 0 cents on the line, infinite capital at stake. But this affront demanded her attention just as much. She would not let an impersonal system, or the humans who hid behind it, stand in her way. And so, in that bustling terminal, the real conflict ignited. It was no longer about a seat. It was about respect. It was about power. It was about making sure that no one, ever, would deny Aisha Grant her rightful place without consequence. The boarding call crackled over the PA and she slipped her tablet into her bag. The next phase of her plan was about to begin. Aisha sat straighter in seat 14C, her gaze fixed on the window as the cabin doors clicked shut. The gentle thrum of the engines built beneath her, a soft reassurance that soon they'd be airborne. She opened her tablet, fingers poised to send another urgent note to Thomas Harrington, when she felt a presence looming. Sarah Monroe appeared at the front of Economy Plus, cart rattling as she advanced. Her name tag caught the overhead light. Sarah Monroe. But her expression was anything but professional. She glanced down at her tablet, then back at Aisha, that same cold glint in her eyes. Aisha closed the tablet and met Sarah's stare. "May I help you?" she asked, voice even. Sarah's lips curled into a mocking half-smile. "Yes, Ms. Grant," she said, her tone drenched in faux regret. "I need to see your boarding pass again." With steady hands, Aisha retrieved the printed pass from her coat pocket. It bore the orange Economy Plus stripe, the seat number 14C bold against a sea of type. She offered it to Sarah, refusing to let her knuckles show the tremor she felt rising. Sarah snatched the pass as though it were an insult. Her grip was tight. The paper crinkled alarmingly in her fist. Without a word, she tore it in half, once, twice, shredding Aisha's proof of status into ragged strips. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Children paused mid-bite on granola bars. Business travelers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The aisle lights overhead seemed to flicker, as if unsettled by Sarah's vicious gesture. Aisha's breath caught. Her chest tightened, every muscle coiling under the weight of humiliation. She watched the fragments of paper flutter to the floor like wounded birds. Sarah took a step back, folded her arms, and let the silence settle. "Perhaps economy is more your speed," Sarah said, voice quiet but cruel. Then she raised her chin and glanced around, daring anyone to intervene. A hush fell over the cabin. The simmering noise of seatbelt buckles clicked off. Overhead bins locked into place. Even the flight attendants in the aisle beyond paused, uncertainty in their posture. Aisha felt the heat rise in her cheeks, and for a moment her vision blurred. She pressed her palms against the armrests, steadying herself. The memory of countless boardrooms flashed through her mind. Moments she'd been dismissed, talked over, sidelined because of her gender or her race. Each slight had built a fortress of resolve in her heart. Each injustice had been stored for days like this. Swallowing, she rose to her feet. Her voice was calm, not the tremor of anger, but the quiet power of someone who refuses to be broken. "You may have torn my pass," she said, eyes locked on Sarah's. "But you'll never tear my resolve." Sarah's smirk faltered, replaced by a twitch of uncertainty. A few passengers turned in their seats, some nodding in encouragement. A young woman 2 rows back offered a timid thumbs up. An older gentleman in loafers cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. Sarah glanced at the remains of the path scattered on the carpet, then back at Aisha. Her posture tightened, as though bracing for an argument. Instead of replying, she clicked her tablet shut and backed away, cart rattling once more as she retreated. Aisha inhaled deeply, chest rising and falling with deliberate calm. She reached for the strips of paper on the floor. Though useless, collecting them felt like reclaiming a piece of her dignity. Folding the largest fragment into her palm, she tucked it into her blazer pocket, a small talisman against further erasure. Moments later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calling final boarding. Aisha slipped past the rows of economy plus seats to the front of the cabin, where first-class passengers sat in smug comfort. She caught Sarah's eye as she walked by, but Sarah looked away, guilt and surprise flickering across her face. As the jet bridge retracted and the engine spooled to life, Aisha settled back into seat 14C. She allowed a single tear to slip free, an acknowledgement of the indignity she'd faced, and a vow that it would not stand. She tapped open her email draft to Thomas. Subject: reservation audit, immediate action required. Thomas: they've escalated. Sarah Monroe tore up my boarding pass in the aisle. Deliberate, humiliating. I want every single log, every timestamp, every operator's badge number who touched my reservation. And I want it now. Aisha. Her fingers hovered for a moment before hitting send. The email whooshed off into the digital ether, a silent assault on the corporate machine that had so casually humiliated her. A jitter of motion caught her eye. Mason Chen, the teenager from Economy Plus, watching her with wide, sympathetic eyes. His father, David, offered a small, respectful nod. Aisha allowed herself a faint smile. Even here, in the unlikeliest of row 14S, she was not alone. The beverage service began, the clink of cups and the murmur of polite conversation filling the space. Aisha accepted a glass of sparkling water from a sympathetic flight attendant, another subtle ally in a sea of passive observers. She raised it briefly in acknowledgement and then positioned herself to look out the window. Below, the tarmac blurred as the plane rolled toward the runway. Chicago's skyline receded, a reminder that beyond every insult, beyond every torn paper and cruel word, lay horizons yet to be conquered. And as the engines roared into ascent, lifting her skyward, Aisha Grant's heart steadied with clarity. Cruelty might scar the moment, but justice, silent or thunderous, would have its day. She would ground this airline, expose every hidden hand, and do it all without once raising her voice. Because in the end, power was not measured in decibels, but in unwavering resolve. The cabin lights dimmed for takeoff. Aisha traced the window's edge with her fingertip, eyes bright with purpose. And as Flight 412 climbed through the clouds, so too did her determination. Unbreakable and ascendant. Aisha leaned back in seat 14C, cradling the lukewarm glass of sparkling water the flight attendant had just handed her. Around her, Economy Plus hummed with the muted rhythms of mid-flight life. The soft whir of air vents, the low murmur of passengers conversing in hushed tones, the distant chime of the beverage cart rolling toward the rear. From here, she could see the golden headdress of first class just beyond the curtain, her rightful domain, now populated by strangers who'd taken her place. Her jaw clenched as she replayed Sarah Monroe's cruelty, the tearing of her boarding pass, the casual smirk, the ruthless satisfaction of a woman who believed rules trumped respect. In that moment, Aisha had tucked the crumpled paper strip into her blazer pocket, a private reminder that paper could be torn, but resolve could not. Now, settled among canvas seats instead of leather, she felt that resolve harden into something unbreakable. A slow wave of empathy rippled through her chest. Decades of muted indignities, from whispered microaggressions in corporate hallways to outright dismissals in client conference rooms. Each one had chipped away at her confidence as a young analyst. but had also forged an unshakable core. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, letting the memory of those slights coalesce into a quiet promise. This time, she would not be sidelined. She set her glass on the tray table and inhaled a steadying breath. As she exhaled, she eased herself out of her seat. Heads turned. A little girl clasped her mother's hand. A businessman with a travel-worn briefcase glanced up from his laptop. Even Sarah Monroe peered through the curtain from first class, eyes narrowing in anticipation. The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Aisha stepped into the aisle, heels clicking against the carpet with deliberate calm. She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the rows of Economy Plus, over sympathetically raised eyebrows, tentative nods of solidarity, and then landed on the curtained entrance to first class. She straightened her shoulders and raised her voice, just enough to carry over ambient noise without rancor or theatrics. "Excuse me," she began, her tone so even it felt surgical. "May I have everyone's attention for a moment?" At once, the cabin fell deadly silent. The whir of vents faded. The clink of cups stopped mid-flight. Even the flight attendants folded themselves into stillness, attentive to the commotion. Aisha's heart hammered, but her voice never wavered. "I'm Aisha Grant." She allowed that simple declaration to hang in the air. "You might recognize me as the CEO of Aerostar Global." A ripple ran through the rows. Eyes widened. A faint murmur passed from seat to seat. Aisha waited, letting the significance settle. "Just a few minutes ago," she continued. "Ms. Monroe here." She glanced toward the first-class curtain where Sarah leaned like a sentinel. "Decided to tear up my boarding pass and then reassigned me to Economy Plus, citing an equipment change." Her words never rose, but each syllable carried unmistakable authority. "I've learned to accept being stripped of my dignity." She held up a single fragment of the torn pass between her fingers, as though presenting evidence. The cabin's hush deepened, dense and expectant. "Do you know who I am?" The question was quiet, almost conversational, but its impact was seismic. The phrase leapt off her tongue, not as entitlement, but as a stark reminder. Respect is earned, and status can be invoked without arrogance. The silence that followed was absolute. First class behind the curtain had grown uncomfortably still. Sarah Monroe's jaw dropped, her scanner dangling uselessly from her wrist. Even the captain's voice over the intercom paused mid-announcement, as if the whole plane inhaled in unison. Aisha lowered the pass fragment and tucked it back into her pocket. She allowed a brief, almost invisible nod to the cabin before closing her speech. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said softly. "I'm asking for basic respect. If I've been wronged, I will address it, but not with anger, and certainly not with aggression. I will address it with action." She met Sarah's gaze through the curtain, letting that promise land. Then, as quietly as she'd risen, she returned to her seat. Each step was a statement of unwavering composure. The resumption of murmured conversations and gentle clinks of service cups felt almost intrusive after that charge of energy. Yet in the wake of her words, the atmosphere had shifted. Solidarity in the eyes of strangers, a newfound deference in the curt nods, the subtle retreat of power from those who had wielded it callously. Back in 14C, Aisha settled once more, aligning her posture with quiet dignity. She reopened her tablet and began a new email, this one more concise, more pointed. Subject: immediate review requested. Incident in flight. Gentlemen, cabin announcement made at 10:15 a.m., reporting deliberate destruction of my boarding pass by flight crew followed by downgrading. Please compile all logs, video feed, and personnel records for review. Aisha. She tapped send, the familiar whoosh, a private triumph. Her pulse slowed, satisfaction spreading through her. Power moves need not be loud. They needed only to be decisive. A gentle hand at her elbow startled her. A flight attendant, another ally in pressed Navy uniform, offered a fresh glass of water with the softest of smiles. No words, just understanding. Aisha accepted it with gratitude, recognizing another small victory in the war for respect. Beyond the curtain, Sarah's stance had shifted from smug triumph to uncertain hesitation. Aisha allowed herself the barest hint of a smile. The cabin lights dimmed for the in-flight service announcement, but in her heart, she felt a lasting glow. The first clear turning point in her silent campaign. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Aisha Grant closed her eyes for a moment. In the hush of mid-flight, she savored the quiet power she'd unleashed. This was her first small climax, her power move that clarified one truth. You can't erase who she is. Not with torn paper, not with older planes retrofitted on a whim, and certainly not with cramped seats. And as the engines hummed their steady rhythm, Aisha felt a deep surety settle in her chest. This flight had shifted. She had shifted it. And the real reckoning was only just beginning. The cabin lights had been dimmed for mid-flight service when Aisha's phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. She glanced down. Thomas Harrington, her chief legal officer, was calling. Nodding to the flight attendant, she slipped into the aisle and pressed the button. A hushed silence followed her voice, as if the entire plane wanted to eavesdrop. "Thomas," she said, settling into a vacant jump seat by the curtain. "What've you got?" His voice came crisp, urgent. "I pulled the reservation logs you requested. It wasn't an algorithm glitch." There was a pause. It was manual. At 5:52 IME, someone in your name hit the downgrade flag on your record. Aisha's breath stilled. "Who?" she asked, tone barely above a whisper. "Carl Whitman," Thomas replied. "He logged in under supervisor credentials at the Coastal Air Ops Center. He specifically targeted your reservation." At the mention of his name, images flickered through her mind. The fortified office at Atlantic's overnight headquarters, the glow of monitors illuminating a solitary figure, a ruthless veteran of an industry she had vowed to transform. How did this even happen? She pressed. Thomas cleared his throat. He overrode the automatic reassignment protocol. No one else saw or logged that action. Our IT team also recovered a stray voice memo from the ops desk. His voice, commenting, "Let her taste a little of what the rest of us endure." The revelation hit her like cold water. Not a random error, not a bureaucratic slip, but a deliberate act of malice. A man with 32 years of service, feeling emboldened to sabotage her flight in petty retaliation for the very acquisition she was there to finalize. Aisha closed her eyes, replaying each indignity, the torn boarding pass, the smirk on Sarah Monroe's face later in the aisle, the murmurs of passengers who had pitied her before pity turned to admiration. She felt the weight of every moment crystallize into a single truth. This hadn't been about seats or equipment at all, but about power. Someone's need to remind her she didn't belong. "Thank you, Thomas," she said finally. "Send me everything, the logs, the voice memo, his credentials. I want it all." "I'm on it," he replied. "And, Aisha, we might want to be ready for more than just procedural fallout. This could get messy." She tapped end, sliding back into 14C as the flight attendant returned with warm towels. The cabin was still hushed, as though anticipating what she might do next. She wrapped the towel around her hands, absorbing its heat. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in the dimly lit Coastal Air Operations Center, Carl Whitman sat back in his worn leather chair, satisfaction playing across his cragged features. He'd arrived on the overnight shift just before dawn, bleary-eyed after his usual heat lamp coffee. When the system flagged first-class passengers for downgrade, his finger had hovered above Elaine Richards's name, an emblem of the so-called corporate raiders coming to dismantle his airline. He had leaned forward, the screen's blue glow dancing in his eyes as he typed a single command. No alarms rang, no supervisor double-checked, just a quiet click that sent a ripple of humiliation across the continent. He'd pressed record on his phone, just for posterity, murmuring, "Let her taste a little of what the rest of us endure," and he'd sat back, chest swelling as he imagined the inconvenience he'd caused the incoming CEO. For Carl, it wasn't about fear or corporate espionage. It was personal, an affront to his years of loyalty, his conviction that this airline belonged to its long-serving employees, not to some faceless conglomerate. In his mind, Elaine Richards represented the end of an era, a high-powered outsider with no respect for the people who'd kept coastal air aloft for decades. Back on the plane, Aisha pressed her thumb against the screen, scrolling through the email notification from Thomas. He'd attached a spreadsheet of system logs, timestamps, user IDs, override codes. She opened the voice memo and listened to Carl's gravelly voice, self-satisfied. "She'll find herself in 14C before she even knows what hit her," he'd said, followed by a choked laugh. Aisha allowed a soft exhale. The power of that one man's cruelty was undeniable, but so was the opportunity it presented. This was no longer a personal slight. It was a window into Coastal Air's culture, one that tolerated sabotage, discrimination, and callous disrespect toward the very travelers who kept its engines running. She set her jaw. "Culture change," she whispered to herself. Those two words echoed through her mind, lined with possibility. She tapped another email to Thomas. Subject: Boardroom presentation, revised agenda. We have definitive proof of deliberate sabotage by a senior Atlantic employee. We need log extracts and Carl's memo integrated into today's presentation. I will demonstrate how this reflects a systemic failure of leadership. Aisha. She hit send. In the soft hum of the cabin, that single click resonated with a deeper resolve. She would not simply reclaim her seat, but reclaim the entire narrative of respect for this airline. As the plane arced toward its cruising altitude, the early morning light filtered through the oval windows, casting brief halos on the carpeted aisle. Aisha reached into her blazer pocket and touched the small scrap of torn boarding pass, her talisman of indignity transformed into ammunition. In that moment, her emotions crystallized. Indignation refined into strategy, hurt transmuted into authority, and a raw sense of injustice refined into the unbreakable promise of retribution. She would ground Coastal Air's complacency, expose every hidden act of sabotage, and demand more than compensation. She would demand accountability. The engine's steady roar seemed to underscore her vow. The silent reckoning had begun. And when Flight 412 finally touched down, it would mark not just a landing, but the beginning of a campaign that Coastal Air would never forget. Aisha sank back into seat 14C and let the cabin's low hum fold around her. The gentle vibration of the wings cutting through thin air was usually a lullaby, but today it felt like a challenge, an invitation to quiet her mounting doubt. She powered her laptop on and watched the screen wake up. The login prompt blinked patiently, reminding her of the deadlines she'd set for herself. But her fingers hovered above the keyboard, frozen. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different path, accepting the promised mileage credit, nodding politely to the Economy Plus steward, and waiting for Miami. She could keep her dignity intact, present her $3,900,000,000 0 cents acquisition pitch exactly as planned, and chalk this up to one more annoyance in a career built on overcoming them. She knew how to play that game. The unflappable executive who never let personal slights seep into her agenda. But even as the thought crossed her mind, her chest tightened. The shredding of her boarding pass by Sarah Monroe. The sharp tear of paper. The flicker of cruelty in those eyes. Replayed behind her lids. The deliberate downgrade orchestrated by Carl Wittmann. The final piece of evidence Thomas had unearthed wasn't an inconvenience. It was an affront. A statement that her presence here didn't matter. A bead of sweat formed at her temple. She exhaled slowly, fingers brushing her temple as if to still her racing blood. If I stay silent, she thought, this will happen again, to me or someone else. And then it struck her, this wasn't merely about a seat. It wasn't even just about her. It was about setting a precedent, about sending a resounding message that respect isn't optional, that dignity isn't a privilege reserved for the comfortable few. Still, doubt gnawed. What if this backlash made her look vindictive? What if headlines tomorrow read, CEO misuses power over airline passenger? The thought flickered across her mind, dampening her resolve. Doubt was a luxury she could ill afford, yet there it was, whispering, "Are you overreacting? Shouldn't you pick your battles?" She closed her laptop without typing a word. The moment it powered down, she felt a sting of frustration. Another piece of the puzzle left undone. Turning her head, she caught sight of Mason Chen peering at her from 2 rows back. His expression was open, curious, unguarded. She remembered how, earlier, he'd offered her a shy thumbs up after Sarah's outburst in first class. It was small, but genuine. A gesture of solidarity from someone who'd suffered rudeness without status. She managed a faint smile. If he sees courage in me, she thought, I owe it to him not to falter now. She pressed her fingertips to the torn fragment of boarding pass in her pocket. The paper's jagged edge a tactile reminder of the indignity she'd endured. A soft chime from her phone broke through the moment. It wasn't Thomas this time, but an alert from her assistant. Board meeting documents delivered to your secure drive. Final prep in 3 hours. The timing felt mocking. A countdown clock ticking toward an agenda that didn't yet include the culture audit she now knew was necessary. She sighed, head resting against the window. Outside, wisps of cloud peeled away under the sun. She envied that clarity, so effortless in nature. Her mind flicked to her father's Mont Blanc pen, tucked into her portfolio at home, an heirloom symbol of both tradition and expectation. She thought about the countless mornings she'd risen before dawn to honor her early promise, to never let anyone tell her she didn't belong. Today, that promise felt both weighty and urgent. Counting 3 breaths, she sat forward and reopened her laptop. This time, there was no hesitation. She drafted a single line at the top of her screen, her personal credo, distilled into a question, if not me, then who? Below it, she mapped out her next move, the sequence of calls that would ripple through Coastal Air's command chain. Each bullet point carried the weight of a decision. FAA notification, SEC whistleblower report, live feed of Carl Wittmann's admission at the boardroom. She paused halfway through, fingers trembling as the enormity of the plan settled around her. It was bold. It was risky. It might brand her as ruthless. But as her mind cleared, she recognized a deeper imperative. This was no longer about retribution, but about responsibility. To every employee, to every passenger, and to herself. A flight attendant emerged from the curtain with a gentle offer of tea. Aisha accepted without looking up. The hot cup nestled in her hands felt grounding. Sipping slowly, she let its warmth anchor her. Around her, the cabin's subdued lighting and the steady drone of engines felt less stifling now, more like a cocoon where transformation incubated. Mason's notebook caught her eye again. He was jotting something down, Perhaps notes on aerodynamics or the world swirling beyond the clouds. She gave him a subtle nod. He smiled back, eyes bright with encouragement. Courage is contagious, she thought, and I'm not here just to survive. I'm here to transform. She closed her laptop gently, a quiet decision made. She wouldn't wait for permission. The next chapter of this flight would belong to her. She squared her shoulders, inhaled one final, steadying breath, and stood. The cabin's low murmur stilled as passengers sensed her intent. She stepped into the aisle, determination radiating from every measured step. No more hesitation. The crisis point had passed. From now on, every action would be driven by purpose, not reaction. And as the swivel door to the cockpit came into view, she knew the true test was about to begin. Aisha Grant was ready. The silent reckoning had sharpened into clarity, and as Flight 412 carved a path through the sky, she prepared to pilot a course toward justice that no one, not even the most entrenched of saboteurs, could divert. The cabin lights were dimmed for cruising, but Aisha couldn't relax. She felt a quiet tremor of anticipation under the gentle hum of Flight 412's engines. The seatbelt sign had gone off, and passengers were beginning to stretch, order drinks, and settle into mid-air routines. Yet Aisha remained poised in 14C, staring out at the endless sky, her jaw set with unspoken resolve. Moments earlier, she had reviewed the evidence Thomas sent. Carl Whitman's override logs, the time-stamped downgrade, and the gravel-voiced memo crowing about humiliation. It was more than enough to prove a deliberate protocol breach, one that could endanger every traveler if left unchecked. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and felt the final barrier of doubt dissolve. This wasn't about retaliation, it was about safety, accountability, and the kind of justice that flows from calm authority. She fished her smartphone from her blazer pocket. The polished screen glowed with the FAA hotline number, pre-saved under Emergency Safety Report. Aisha's fingertip hovered above the dial button for only a second before she pressed. The quiet resistance of the plastic gave way to a short, ringing tone. Federal Aviation Administration. A steady voice answered. "This is the Safety Operations Center." "Good afternoon," Aisha began, her tone clear and unhurried, like delivering a boardroom address. "My name is Aisha Grant, CEO of Aerostar Global. I'm calling from Flight 412 en route to Miami to report a critical safety protocol violation involving a fleet-wide equipment change that was intentionally misrepresented." She paused, letting the words land. "I need all Coastal Air aircraft grounded immediately pending a full technical inspection." Silence answered her, punctuated only by the soft click of buttons. She could almost feel the operator leaning in, processing the request. "Ma'am?" the voice said finally, edged with surprise. "Ground the entire Coastal Air fleet? That's an extraordinary request." Aisha's voice remained level, quietly authoritative. "Extraordinary situations demand extraordinary measures. I have documentation showing a senior operations supervisor manually downgraded my reservation to Economy Plus, then publicly destroyed my boarding pass. In direct violation of our mutual safety protocols, if he can override manifest controls, who's to say maintenance logs haven't been tampered with? We have to assume risk until we verify integrity." A faint hum of typing came through the line. "I understand, please hold." She ended the call and stood, stepping deliberately into the aisle. Passengers turned to watch, curiosity and concern mingling in their eyes. She made her way to the curtain and slipped through into the first-class cabin. Sarah Monroe looked up, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Grant," Sarah said, a tremor in her voice. "Is there a problem?" Aisha slid her phone onto the attendant's podium. "I just reported a serious safety breach to the FAA," she said quietly. Effective immediately, coastal air aircraft are grounded until they complete full technical inspections. That includes this one. Sarah swallowed. The other flight attendants froze, the cart still halfway down the aisle. First-class passengers sat stunned, their champagne flutes half lifted. The sound of a flight attendant's panicked gasp echoed from economy. Aisha returned to her seat as the intercom crackled. The captain's calm voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Wilson. We've received an FAA ground order for all coastal air aircraft. We're returning to the gate. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." A collective intake of breath rose from every cabin section. Back in Economy Plus, the murmurs swelled into a chorus of shocked exclamations. Children clutched parents' sleeves. Business travelers glanced at their watches, then at each other. A flight attendant hurried past, the overhead signs flicking from "Fasten seatbelt" to "Return to gate." Aisha watched the ripple of surprise and unease spread across the cabin. The plane had slowed its forward thrust. The engines eased into a metallic hum of reversal. Moments later, an announcement blared overhead. "Flight 412 is diverting back to the gate in 5 minutes. We apologize for the inconvenience and will keep you updated." The mood shifted from confusion to dread. People exchanged resigned glances. This was no mere delay. This was a full stop. Aisha felt a rush of sober satisfaction. She pressed her fingertip to the torn scrap of her boarding pass in her pocket, its jagged edge a private emblem of the wrong she'd corrected. She reached for her glass of water, lifting it to her lips in a quiet toast to justice. Around her, passengers watched her with new respect. Some smiled in solidarity. Others simply observed the composed authority radiating from her. Down in the operations center on the ground, John Pierce's voice crackled over Aisha's speakerphone. "Mr. Grant, FAA confirms the ground order for all coastal air flights. You've effectively paused the entire fleet." His tone was a mix of awe and alarm. "What's next?" Aisha set her glass down. "Next, we document the procedure. Then we address the SEC. But for now, thank you." She ended the call and tucked her phone away, her pulse steady. The plane's wheels touched the tarmac with a muted clatter. The cabin brakes engaged. A hush fell again, deeper this time, charged with the weight of what had just happened. As she peered out the window at the jet bridge sliding slowly into place, Aisha Grant allowed herself a small, private smile. She had wielded power without aggression, turned a moment of personal humiliation into a shield for hundreds of passengers. She had reminded everyone, especially the critics who doubted her, that safety and respect are non-negotiable, and that sometimes the quietest voice carries the greatest authority. And in that suspended moment between descent and taxi, she knew the real journey was just beginning. The terminal jet bridge wedged against Flight 422's door felt like a jury's gavel slamming in silent judgment. Passengers sat in stunned silence, seatbelts still fastened, as cabin crew guided them off the plane. Aisha Grant remained in her aisle seat until the last traveler stepped into the jet bridge's fluorescent tunnel. Then, she stood and drifted to the galley, nodding a brief thank you to the lead flight attendant, Jennifer. "Mrs. Grant?" Jennifer asked quietly, concern and curiosity in her eyes. "What happens next?" Aisha's expression was calm, steely. "I'm going to call the SEC." She pulled her phone from her blazer pocket, already prepped with the hotline number for the office of the whistleblower. Jennifer's eyes widened. A hush fell even among the flight crew. A few rows back, Mason Chen peeked over his seat, offering an encouraging thumbs up. Aisha allowed a small smile but focused on the task. She found a corner of the galley, muted the intercom, and dialed. "Office of the Whistleblower," a firm voice answered. "SEC hotline? How can we help you today?" "Good afternoon," Aisha said, her tone controlled but urgent. "My name is Aisha Grant, CEO of Aerostar Global. I'd like to file an emergency whistleblower report concerning Coastal Air's deliberate falsification of maintenance and safety records." She paused, listening as the SEC operator tapped keys. "Yes, I have evidence of manual overrides in the manifest controls, and a voice recording from their operations supervisor admitting intent to teach me a lesson. This goes beyond customer service. It implicates systemic risk to air safety." The operator's voice was professional but brisk. "We'll need the documentation you referenced. Please provide logs, correspondence, and any recordings. Our team will open a docket immediately." Aisha exhaled, steadying her racing heart. "I'm forwarding a secure link to the files now. Please confirm once received." She hung up and tapped her screen. An encrypted message sent to the SEC secure portal, bundling logs, Carl Whitman's voice memo, and internal Coastal Air emails ordering staff silence. In the cabin, fellow passengers watched her, with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. A hush fell, broken only by the distant shuffle of deplaning feet. Jennifer returned, her expression a mix of respect and concern. "Is everything all right, Ms. Grant?" Aisha folded her phone away. "Everything's under control." She swept a reassuring glance over the cabin. "Thank you, Jennifer. You handled this beautifully." Moments later, the jet bridge retracted, and Aisha stepped off the plane, flanked by a small entourage from Aerostar's legal and communications teams. Cameras from her corporate liaison were already rolling, footage that would later appear in an internal briefing, and possibly even in a controlled press release. Back at Aerostar Global's Miami headquarters, the effects rippled faster than any plane could fly. At exactly 1:45 p.m., Coastal Air's ticker symbol CAR began its most dramatic plummet in years. The numbers crawled across Bloomberg terminals. 15% within the first 15 minutes, erasing billions in market value. Traders shouted into phones. Family offices scrambled to assess exposure. By 2:00 p.m., headlines blazed across financial websites. Coastal Air under SEC investigation. Stock plunges 15%. Whistleblower CEO grounds airline now targets financial misconduct. In Coastal Air's sleek glass tower, the mood swung from smug confidence to frantic panic. CFO Rebecca Martinez watched her screens with widening eyes. "Did you authorize this?" she hissed at her head of operations, who shook his head mutely. The SEC notice had appeared simultaneously across all internal networks. "Urgent. Whistleblower report filed. Expect inquiry." On the 22nd floor conference room, board member Harold Berkowitz pounded his fist on the mahogany table. "This is catastrophic. A 15% crash in one session, and it's going to bleed into the next." He glared at Chairman William Foster. "Someone shut this down now." Foster pinched the bridge of his nose, his expression tight. "Our IT team says the report came directly from Ms. Grant's phone. She sent it from 40,000 feet. This isn't an internal leak we can contain. We have an SEC docket." He turned to the General Counsel, Patricia Ackerfer. "Draft our response letter. We need full cooperation. And get me Thomas Harrington's contact." Meanwhile, at Aerostar's press center, Aisha stood before a small group of reporters and Aerostar's staff. The carriage lights flicked on. She faced the cameras with unshaken poise. "Earlier today, I reported a safety and financial protocol violation at Coastal Air," she began, voice calm and measured. "I did so not out of vindictiveness, but out of obligation to every traveler and investor who trusted this airline. If a simple boarding pass can be torn with impunity, imagine what risks lie hidden in unchecked maintenance logs." Her gaze swept the room. "I have full confidence that the SEC will conduct a thorough investigation. Aerostar Global will continue to support regulatory oversight, and we will not finalize our acquisition until Coastal Air demonstrates real accountability. Reporters tapped their pens, nodding. Flashbulbs popped. In the back row, Mason Chen's father, David, watched with pride, as did several Aerostar employees who had witnessed Aisha's silent struggle earlier on Flight 412. Upstairs in Coastal Air's corridors, the board members huddled. Patricia stood with printed copies of Aisha's public statement. "She's positioned this as a corporate responsibility move," Patricia said. "We can't attack her personally. We need a swift, genuine action plan." Foster nodded. "Agreed. Prepare an independent safety audit, commission a third-party review of all maintenance and IT protocols, and publicly commit to it by tomorrow morning." Back at the terminal, Aisha slipped into a rideshare car bound for her Miami hotel. Through the window, she could see ground vehicles swarming the tarmac. Coastal airplanes lined up for inspection. The scars of her calls were visible in every grounded aircraft, every agitated ground crew member. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Confirmation. Docket 64-67, 890 opened. Initial inquiry under Section 21F of the Securities Exchange Act. She allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction. Mason Chen, still aboard another Aerostar flight scheduled after Flight 412, finally made it off the ground, sent her a text. "You're my hero, Ms. Grant. Thank you for standing up." She smiled, tapping a quick reply. "Thank you, Mason. We all deserve safety and respect." In that moment, Aisha Grant felt the weight of responsibility settle into pride. She had turned humiliation into reform, one phone call at a time, and as the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the Miami skyline in shades of rose and gold, she knew that the true measure of power lay not in titles or seats, but in the courage to speak up and to ground an entire airline when justice demanded it. A hushed tension settled over the glass-walled boardroom at Coastal Air's headquarters in Midtown as Aisha Grant entered, flanked by Thomas Harrington and Patricia Ackefer. The long mahogany table gleamed under soft LED lighting. 14 board members sat rigidly in high-backed leather chairs. William Foster at the head, Harold Berkowitz beside him, Rebecca Martinez and the rest arrayed on either side. Each face bore a mixture of anticipation and thinly veiled apprehension. William Foster rose and offered a curt nod. "Mrs. Grant, welcome. We've gathered to finalize the acquisition terms." His voice was polite, but carried the weight of lingering resentment. "We understand you've submitted revisions?" Aisha met his gaze evenly. "Yes," she replied, voice calm but firm. "But before we discuss terms, there's an urgent matter that demands your immediate attention." She glanced at Thomas, who tapped his tablet and projected the first slide onto the room's wall-size screen. The projection lit up with a time-stamped log file. Override Action 5:52 AEM, Supervisor IW, Carl Whitman, followed by a waveform of audio. Thomas clicked play. Carl's gravelly voice echoed, "Let her taste what the rest of us endure." A collective gasp rippled around the table. Rebecca Martinez's eyes widened so sharply her half-mile vanished. Harold Berkowitz's hand knocked against a water glass, rattling ice cubes. Foster's jaw tightened. He looked as though he'd swallowed a lemon. Aisha stepped forward. Carl Whitman, a 32-year veteran of Coastal Air's overnight operations, manually overrode the manifest controls to downgrade my ticket. He then deliberately destroyed my boarding pass in flight, humiliated me, and put safety at risk by abusing protocol. She let the words hang, letting each board member absorb the gravity. She tapped her remote and the next slide displayed a table of maintenance logs flagged for review. Unlogged engine checks, unexplained data entries, backdated records. If he could falsify passenger manifests, what's to stop him, or others, from tampering with safety records? This is not an isolated customer service blunder. It's a symptom of a systemic leadership failure. A murmur rose. Berkovitz cleared his throat, eyes flicking to Foster. Ms. Grant, this is serious, but does it justify altering the acquisition agreement? We condemn Mr. Whitman's conduct. He's been suspended, effective immediately. Aisha's voice remained steady. Suspension is a start, but I need assurances that Coastal Air's leadership will root out this culture of impunity. That's why I submitted revised terms. An immediate culture audit by a third party, a restructured leadership team with your top executives reporting to a joint oversight committee, and stringent compliance protocols with quarterly reviews. Foster's lips thinned. These demands are extreme. They change the deal significantly. Aisha met his gaze squarely. They reflect the reality I witness, a casual disregard for respect and safety. If Coastal Air hopes to survive, or to even maintain its existing fleet, its leadership must hold itself accountable. Anything less, and this will happen again, perhaps with far graver consequences. Silence stretched. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas advanced to the final slide, a summary of media coverage. Headlines flashed across the screen. CEO grounds airline, aviation safety in question. Opens probe into Coastal Air records. Share price plunges 15% amid scandal. Foster's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, color draining from his face. He looked back at Aisha, measuring her for the first time not as an adversary, but as the arbiter of his company's fate. Rebecca Martinez cleared her throat softly. William, regardless of our pride, without Horizon's acquisition, we face bankruptcy within 6 months. The market won't forgive this. She turned to Aisha. Your revised terms, while stringent, might be our only path to stability. A low murmur of agreement rippled around the table. Berkovitz leaned forward. We'll accept your terms, with one amendment, a 60-day transition for leadership changes rather than 30. His tone held reluctant respect. Aisha nodded. That is acceptable. She clicked her remote one last time, and the slide changed to show the final acquisition outline with her conditions embedded. Is there anything else? Foster exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders like a released spring. He gathered the marked-up documents. Let's proceed with signatures. Within the next hour, pens scratched across parchment, handshakes were exchanged. A press release was drafted, announcing not just the $3,900,000,000 acquisition, but a joint commitment to root out cultural failings, bolster safety protocols, and implement an independent audit. Press photographers snapped images as Aisha and Foster stood side by side, an uneasy alliance, but a necessary one. As the meeting adjourned, Foster approached Aisha, offering a firm handshake. You made your point, he said quietly. I hope you find Coastal Air worth saving. Aisha returned his grip, her expression warm but resolute. It's worth saving, Mr. Foster. If we do it right. She paused, eyebrow arching. And if anyone dares to override safety again, they'll find me a far more formidable opponent. He managed a thin smile. Fair enough. Later, as she exited the building into the Miami afternoon heat, Aisha allowed herself a moment of reflection. The boardroom had tested her resolve, but she had turned the tables, exposing betrayal and rewriting the terms of power. She reached into her pocket, fingering the scrap of torn boarding pass. It had begun as a symbol of her humiliation. Now it was the emblem of systemic change. A taxi idled at the curb. As she climbed in, she heard the soft ping of an email. All board members signed. Transition plan approved. Third-party audit engaged. She leaned back, watching Miami traffic swirl by. The acquisition had been saved, but more importantly, a culture had been challenged. And as the late afternoon sun glinted off the taxi's hood, Aisha Grant felt something shift inside her. A validation not just of her position, but of her purpose. In a world of torn paper and silent slights, she had proven that respect, once demanded, could never be undone. The morning sun slanted through the blinds of Coastal Air's executive offices, casting long bands of light across the polished floors. In the lobby, a bank of digital screens displayed two headlines side by side. Board implements culture audit, leadership shapeshift underway. Carl Whitman, former ops supervisor, faces termination. Aisha Grant watched from the Aerostar liaison suite, the corner office overlooking Biscayne Bay. Her pulse was steady, her posture relaxed. But inside, she felt a quiet surge of vindication. What began as a personal affront had rippled outward, forcing real change in a century-old airline. Down the hall, Patricia Ackerfer read aloud the final details to the assembled board members. Carl Whitman, terminated effective immediately, pending a formal investigation into policy violations. CFO Rebecca Martinez placed on temporary leave while the third-party audit examines financial controls. Safety Review Committee, established with joint Aerostar and Coastal Air leadership, chaired by an external aviation expert. Mandatory culture and bias training, rolled out company-wide next week, with 100% participation required for all staff. Quarterly compliance audits to be conducted by an independent firm for the next 2 years. A hush fell as each bullet was absorbed. William Foster, Coastal Air's acting CEO, cleared his throat. "These measures are more rigorous than we ever anticipated," he admitted. "But necessary. Thank you, Ms. Grant, for forcing our hand." Aisha inclined her head. "Thank you for acting decisively. Culture isn't changed by apologies alone. It requires accountability at the top." Her calm delivery underscored the gravity. This was about more than a seat. It was about the respect and safety of every traveler and employee. In a smaller conference room, Carl Whitman gathered his belongings. His face, once flushed with self-satisfaction, was now pale. He'd believed his small act of rebellion would go unnoticed. Instead, it had provoked an industry-wide firestorm. He paused at the door, glancing back at the boardroom plaque. Coastal Air, founded 1928. For him, it marked not only the end of a career, but a personal reckoning with decades of unchallenged privilege. Taylor's words, across town, the SEC issued a brief statement. Coastal Air cooperates fully with ongoing investigation. Actions taken reflect commitment to compliance. Traders watched the stock tick upwards as stability returned. Aisha monitored the uptick, plus 8% since yesterday's low. She allowed herself a faint smile. It wasn't about profit, but it was a welcome indicator that accountability breeds confidence. Late that afternoon, word of Coastal Air's new leadership filtered into airports nationwide. Gate agents briefed on bias training. Maintenance crews received fresh mandates. Even first-class lounges displayed notices encouraging feedback on service and inclusion. The airline's once stale atmosphere felt charged with possibility. Back on her Miami hotel balcony, Aisha gazed at the shimmering bay. A glass of sparkling water sat untouched at her side. She reflected on the journey. A torn boarding pass, a single phone call, and now a corporate transformation that would ripple for years. The responsibility had weighed on her. She could have moved on after the boardroom victory, But she understood that true justice demands follow-through. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mason Chen. "I read about the audit. Proud of you, Ms. Grant." She typed back, "Thank you, Mason. This is just the beginning." As dusk fell, the Miami skyline lit up, an ever-turning world where power and purpose collide. Aisha closed her eyes, savoring the moment of hard-won change. For her, and for every passenger who expected more than a seat, who expected respect, this was a reckoning fulfilled. And because she stood firm, Coastal Air's future would no longer tolerate anything less. 3 months had passed since Flight 4212's unexpected return to the gate. Today, Aisha Grant stood on the stage of Coastal Air's newly christened Aerostar Coastal Airways headquarters, bathed in the glow of a giant screen behind her. The auditorium was packed. Long-time employees with calloused hands, senior leaders in crisp suits, and in the front row sat Rebecca Martinez, newly promoted to president of the airline division. Beside her, David and Mason Chin, those unlikely allies from Economy Plus, beamed with quiet pride. Aisha paused, letting the applause settle into a respectful hush. She looked out at the sea of faces. Flight attendants who'd once torn boarding passes in frustration, mechanics who'd long felt unvalued, gate agents nervous about change. Today, they weren't mere observers. They were participants in something bigger than themselves. 3 months ago, Aisha began, voice steady and warm, we faced a moment of reckoning. A single decision threatened not only a CEO's dignity, but the very safety and culture of this airline. But adversity can be a catalyst for transformation. Behind her, the screen shifted to slides of data. Customer satisfaction up 12%, employee courtesy scores up 22%, flight delays down 15%. Every bar graph and testimonial underscored the progress born from accountability. A rebranding isn't just about a new name or logo, she continued. It's about honoring a heritage that began in 1928 while committing to a future defined by equity, excellence, and accountability. She gestured to the logo, combining Aerostar's soaring wing motif with Coastal Air's classic lighthouse symbol, and a ripple of approval passed through the room. Mason leaned toward his father and whispered, "She's so calm up there." David smiled. "That's true leadership," he replied. Aisha shared a small smile. "We asked for honest feedback and got it. We implemented inclusive leadership training, empowered frontline staff to report concerns, and established quarterly culture audits with an independent firm." She nodded to Rebecca Martinez. "Thank you, Rebecca, for leading that effort." Rebecca stood and received a round of applause, her eyes misting slightly. Aisha continued, "Today my car is waiting to take me back to Manhattan, but my heart remains here, with all of you who chose to rebuild rather than resist. You proved that respect isn't just a courtesy, it's the foundation of safety and success." She clicked a remote, and the lights brightened as a curtain behind her dropped away to reveal a full-scale mock-up of the new first-class cabin. Cream leather seats with built-in screens, widened aisles, and a subtle olive and gold palette echoing the new brand. Gasps of wonder rose from the crowd. "Welcome aboard," Aisha said softly, stepping off the stage to walk among her colleagues. She felt hands on her shoulder, nods of admiration, even tears from those who'd endured decades of stifled voices. She stopped by a group of flight attendants. Some remembered her from that fateful morning. One reached out hesitantly. "Thank you for giving us a voice," she said. Aisha's throat tightened. "Thank you for speaking up," she replied. "Change is a two-way street." As she returned to the front, the audience rose to give her a standing ovation. The applause echoed not for a triumphant takeover, but for a shared journey toward a better, more inclusive airline. Later, as Aisha exited the building under a golden Miami sunset, she paused to look back at the glowing sign above the entrance. Aerostar Coastal Airways. It symbolized more than a merger. It represented the promise that respect and accountability would guide every flight, every employee, every passenger from this moment forward. And in that quiet triumph, Aisha Grant felt the true power of her position, not to control, but to inspire, not to dominate, but to transform. That was the legacy she would leave, one story, one flight, and one horizon at a time.